My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we can tell a hawk from a handsaw, and we know there is something rotten in Kislev.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
Something Rotten in Kislev is a 120-page adventure for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay that forms the fourth or fifth part, depending on how you count things, of the Enemy Within campaign. It was first released by Games Workshop in 1988 and was reprinted by Hogshead Publishing in 1999. We are reviewing the Hogshead edition. The adventure was designed by Ken Ralston, with additional material by Graham Davis. The cover art is by Richard Dolan, and internal illustrations are by Paul Bonner, Ian Cook, H, Martin McKenna, Tim Pollard, and Maz Shepard. The central feature of this book is a set of 3 adventures that take place in the frozen, not Russia, known as Kislev. These adventures can be played as a continuation of the Greater Enemy Within campaign, part of a Kislev-focused campaign, or as individual one-off adventures. And interestingly, the adventures contain some notes for how to use them in a setting that is not Kislev. Prior to the adventures, the text gives us lots of information about the region of Kislev, including its climate, resources, flora and fauna, and so on. This section also includes information about the principal peoples of this land, their social structure, and an interesting page called The Life of the Kislevite Peasant. We also get a surprisingly detailed historical timeline of Kislev, going back some 8,000 years from the present.
Roughly 20 pages in, we get to the first adventure, The Beast Child. In this one, the village of Voltsara is being terrorized by a band of beastmen who have their lair deep in a nearby forest. The party is tasked with rooting out these beastmen, but in order to locate them, they must first find the son of a local charcoaler, the son being the eponymous half-beast beast child, who can lead them to the lair. Finding the beast child is a bit of an adventure in itself, involving dealing with a variety of forest spirits, having a contest against an entity called Father Bear, and avoiding the terrible Vodyanoi, a spirit also known as Grandfather Drowner. Upon finding the beast child, a strange fellow who only communicates through body movements and hand gestures, the party tracks down the beastmen and has a battle with them. A chaos warrior among the beastmen escapes to a ruined dwarven temple. The remainder of the adventure is a short dungeon crawl inside the temple. Around 50 pages in, we have the second adventure, Death Takes a Holiday. This one involves the walled town of Chernozavtra. A necromancer and his zombies have overrun the town, and now they're just hanging out. A religious group known as the Dolgans have been trying to reclaim the town for over 20 years. Meanwhile, a civilized group of hobgoblins has grown weary of the Dolgans and their siege of Chernozavtra because the Dolgans engage in raids on the hobgoblin trade routes in order to fund their activities. The player characters arrive in the middle of this political tension between the Dolgans and the hobgoblins. Ultimately, they get wrapped up in a negotiation between the two camps that involves the player characters having to root out the aforementioned necromancer in Chernozavtra. Now, the party can approach this task in a number of ways, and the module goes on at some length to game out possible scenarios for the GM, but ultimately the player characters end up having to have an audience with the necromancer, Enendil. Turns out the necromancer is kind of a swell guy. He's not evil, he's just misunderstood, and he only got into this necromancy business in the first place to bring his dead lover back, and now he's just hanging out with dead people, whose company he seems to prefer. This part of the adventure includes a very detailed, multi-page lesson on necromancy by Enendil to the player characters. He even gives them some old magic items he doesn't need anymore, and then sends them on their way. The conclusion of the adventure involves the party having to face the Dolgans and Hobgoblins, possibly even being chased down by them, since they did not complete their task.
Around 75 pages in, we get to the third adventure, The Champions of Death, A Choice of Evils in Bolgazgrad. This one involves the colony of Bolgazgrad, which has grown tired of their Tsar's inability to defend them from the agents of chaos, and so they have turned to the elven sorcerer Sulring Durgol and his army of undead. Side note, Sulring taught the necromancer in the last adventure everything he knows. This one starts with the party getting prepared for their mission of taking down Sulring. This involves hitting up a lot of temples, each of which are given a good amount of detail in the text, where they can receive blessings and helpful items. And then we have the journey to Bolgazgrad, in which we have a few encounters, including one with a very knowledgeable farmer who can give the party information about the routine and general layout of the town of Bolgazgrad. They also have an encounter with a woman called Kaya Villanova, a sort of border inspector who warns them to make no trouble while in the colony, and in particular, to not be too judgmental about the undead soldiers. Then we get a fair amount of detail about important places in the town. The party is expected to search around these places until they discover their true aim, to infiltrate the Temple of the Ancient Allies, where Solring is holed up. The bulk of the adventure is in the Temple of the Ancient Allies, which is a dungeon crawl, although one with a lot of social encounters involving multiple levels, key locations, and monsters. All of it leads up to a final encounter with Solring and his dragon, Kretox. Importantly, this final encounter is extremely difficult to win via combat, a matter which is discussed at some length, and the players have the option of handling the situation in some other way, up to and including becoming allies of Solring. The text ends with some pre-generated player characters and the various handouts and maps used in the 3 adventures. So, bona fides, how have we used this in our gaming? Jason?
I have only read it in preparation for this episode.
Commendable. I ran it for my online group using Warhammer 1st Edition, and the 3 adventures took us 7 sessions of 2 hours each.
Awesome. Well, things we liked about Something Rotten in Kislev. I will start with a big picture observation about this text, and I think it probably applies to the Enemy Within campaign more broadly, but it feels particularly acute in this one, which is there's a very interesting point of view here, which is that not everything should be handled with combat and killing. And this sort of point of view is baked into pretty much every part of the adventure. Interestingly, each adventure, in their different ways, encourages the player characters to get to know the various people involved in the adventure and understanding their culture and their ways. And I thought that was a really, really interesting approach. Most of the encounters are social in nature. I found just from a read that my expectations were being defied at nearly every turn, especially in that second adventure, which does not turn out how you imagine it's going to based off the setup. Like, you think it's going to be a big fight with a bunch of undead, but it's not. It's this like strange, chummy encounter with a necromancer. Yeah. And even in that final big bad encounter in the third adventure, the GM is given a lot of support for how to sort of telegraph the terrible danger of doing this via combat and, other ways that the characters might go about, quote, winning. So what do you think about that as a thesis? Like, it just feels like it has this point of view where it wants you to be doing things that are not combat. And I thought that was interesting.
It is interesting. I think that is a good point of the book. But I do have the caveat that it feels like it's slightly too pleased with itself for having this unusual point of view. Like the text is quite sort of, but you weren't expecting that all the time. Lots of these little
right,
asides that end in exclamation marks saying, you'll find the zombies here are quite different, which is a little grating. But for all that, it's interesting and it's definitely memorable. I would say it has lots of great scenes, even if maybe the adventures aren't, as a total package in each case, that great. But things like the hobgoblin camp that you have to deal with, just that whole, as you say, it's unexpected. Like, the second adventure, I think, embodies that in a really interesting way, because there's all these situations. Essentially, the party arrive, they crest a hill to see the town they're aiming for, which is on an island in the middle of a river, and they can see an armed camp in the way. And like immediately they're riding down the hill and they know they have to go through it, but they don't know what's going to happen. Once they deal with that, they cross the river. There's yet more, not surprising, but worrying things. They know they have to go into another armed camp, and then they know that they have to try and break into this fortified city. So in every case, it's a bit like a horror adventure. Like, something difficult is coming, but you also know that you can't just charge in with swords drawn, because it's literally thousands of armed fighters waiting for you. And that does seem to be the theme of all 3 adventures in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting because, so this is the fourth or fifth or 100th book in the Enemy Within campaign we've covered on this show. And I think I've made this comment before, which is, for the previous ones, my sort of like overriding thought or overarching thought was, where are the monsters? Like it's so much like, yeah, it's like so much city-based encounters, is so much like social encounters. And I think you described one of them as what was it? A court crawl or something like that, right?
Court crawl, yeah.
And that was really interesting. And so here we have monsters. We got quite a lot of monsters, actually. They're packed into every adventure. It's really different from the others in that way. And yet, we're not really fighting the monsters in a lot of cases. It does manage to swing back to this type of adventure that the Enemy Within campaign is. And I guess maybe this is more for questions, but I'm curious, like, is this a feature of Warhammer in general? I don't know much about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Like, is there this emphasis on, like, social encounters and not fighting things?
Yes and no, I think. It's definitely been a big theme in the published adventures that you have these memorable characters that you interact with. Like, another one of the most famous ones is A Rough Night of the Three Feathers. It's just a roadside inn that's packed with NPCs that you meet and spend one night while 7 different plots are happening all at once.
Right, yeah.
Traditionally, fighting has been a bit of a thing, and there is this sort of weird, invisible Warhammer campaign that is assumed to be going on. Like, all the Enemy Within books seem to take it as read that in between what they've written, you'll have been just tussling with beastmen, raiding parties in the woods, and so on, which I think in practice doesn't really happen that much, simply because the Enemy Within is so long. If you do that, you just don't have time for anything in your life.
Yeah.
So, I think that the default campaign that the authors imagine they don't need to write scenes for, or scenarios for, is your more classic wandering the countryside fighting stuff. But the things that actually get written down, yeah, you're right, they're always hooked onto these patron or antagonist characters that are almost always very colourful as well.
I'm just trying to think about my experience with old D&D, which was mostly 2nd edition, to be fair. And 2nd edition is known for its big settings, right? Like, settings were a big deal in 2e D&D. I didn't play a lot of pre-written campaigns and modules when I ran 2nd edition. I mostly made up my own stuff, and so I don't have like a strong memory of whether this was also a thing in D&D. These court crawls, these social encounters, I just don't recall that. But 1st edition D&D, I think, is probably very, very combat focused. I've read a lot of those modules at this point, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of like connective tissue as far as like grand campaign or story. They're just sort of like isolated dungeon crawls where you're expected to go in and kill everything and get the treasure, right? And so I just think it's kind of interesting to compare the two systems and philosophies, and I'm not really sure like where I am at in terms of my memory of D&D and how it compares, and so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's just kind of where I'm at right now.
I'm also not best placed to, because I played a lot of Warhammer when I was younger, so
right.
But no, my impression from the adventures that I have played from what we could call the classic D&D era, so up to and including 2nd ed, basically, there are always lots of characters around. Like, if you think about Against the Cult of the Reptile God,
right,
the whole village full of these people, but I don't think any of them, except maybe the old woman who knew everything, have a real baked-in personality to them. Like, if you've played a Warhammer adventure, someone will say to you, so how did you deal with... So, they'll name someone from Power Behind the Throne, like the Graf's champion. See, I can even remember the names. Dieter Schmiedhammer, right?
Right,
and
yeah.
Someone who was in a different group will say, oh, yeah, our group did this and that. And they'll sort of talk about them like you do a character from a movie. Whereas I don't think that happens with D&D adventures usually.
I don't think it does, yeah. People talk about D&D more in terms of, like, monsters, I feel like. Like, oh, remember there was that red dragon here, there was that black dragon here, or we faced the drow queen here. I don't know, it's interesting. Like, I think that's how I always remember, like, D&D conversations like this going, It's very, like, focused on monsters and what do we kill. So I just think it's an interesting difference. So, yeah, this point of view, maybe even agenda that the adventure seems to have, or the module seems to have, was interesting to me. Another thing I want to talk about, I didn't put this in my notes, but it occurs to me that it's worth pointing out. This text says in the beginning that you can use something rotten in Kislev basically in one of 3 ways. Either as a continuation of the Enemy Within, as its own Kislev-focused campaign, or the sort of springboard for a Kislev-focused campaign, or as individual one-off adventures. And something I like that the text does is it backs that up in a big way, right? It doesn't just say that. It is totally 100% backed up in the text. I mean, the GM is given so much advice on how to use this material in each of those three contexts, up to and including what I think is a pretty incredible amount of detail about Kislev and its people and its culture, but also like just advice for how to use the adventures in different contexts, even as we noted, using them not in Kislev, which I thought was intriguing. I appreciated that. I don't know if it's like, you know, it's not something that like applies to me personally because I'm never going to run this, but I appreciated it because it felt like they really considered all these possibilities. They weren't just throwing that out there, you know?
Yeah, some thought had been put into it. Because, I mean, there's not that many pages of info about Kislev. It's maybe 18 or 19 pages. But it does feel like there's enough in here that, like, I reckon I could just take this book and run a mini campaign of, you know, a bit longer than we actually spent on the adventure as part of the Enemy Within. And yeah, all those sort of pointers, each separate section saying if you're doing this with the Enemy Within, if you're doing it as a Kislev campaign. The Enemy Within part worked well for me, and I think it looks like they'd considered what you need for all the other options as well. Yeah.
Well, let's dive into some of the things that you liked about it, Tom. What do you think?
All right. Well, I mean, let's start with the outside. This has great cover art. Like, it has this color, like painting of maybe a fight in Chernozavtra with a swarm of zombies trying to get a guy who's swinging an axe while he's standing on top of some tall place, but the background wouldn't be quite right for that. So I suspect it's more like a general impressionistic, not Russia fantasy zombie fight. But it
feels like a pastiche of the whole thing. Yeah.
Really nice, though. Inside the book, again, it's one of those things where I think the standard of the art is high enough that, like with DCC Adventures, you sort of become a bit numb to it. So, like, it's all good, but nothing's really iconic for me in here. It's like, it's quite good. I like the way it illustrates scenes that happen in the adventure. It shows you a hobgoblin NPC, and it has a group of identifiably the same 4 PCs going through the events of each adventure, which is quite good. But I mean, I don't know, none of it is quite... Until I look in the book again, I don't remember any of these illustrations. Yeah.
I have this strange evolving opinion on the art within the Enemy Within campaign books, and it started rather poor, but I've come to appreciate it more and more as time has gone on. I agree, there's nothing in this one that stands out as... I can't remember which other one it was that we did, but there was this one illustration in one of them that was like this guy whose guts were just spilled everywhere, and that was a grim, gruesome image, and I still remember it. There's nothing quite like that in Something Rotten in Kislev, but I do like it, though. I think it's pretty good. The artist does a really good job of showing the emotion of the various characters in the pictures. Like, they have, like, little facial expressions that sort of tell part of the story of what's going on in the picture. I think the people of the Warhammer universe, at least as depicted in these drawings, are still incredibly ugly. They're just such ugly people. There's actually one pre-generated NPC in here. It has a portrait. I think it's the first one. He's like approaching, or even the second one too, Dolgan Jim and Roland Eberhardt. They're approaching 6 or 7 on the 10-point scale of physical attractiveness, but they're like the only ones in the whole damn campaign. Everyone else in this campaign is a 2. But I think that adds to the charm of the artwork. I think Warhammer's just meant to be kind of a gritty, ugly thing, and that's okay. I've come to terms with it.
Dolgan Jim actually became one of our PCs for a new player who joined in this. So but they're all pretty ugly. There's actually a good bit where the Beast Child guy who only communicates through gesture, and there's a series of illustrations of him doing the different gestures that the GM is supposed to do. Which brings me neatly on to, oh man, some of these scenes, or little sequences, that is one of them. Obviously, I was playing online, so I couldn't do all the full body mimes it instructs you to do over a 2.5 page sequence of explaining where the Beastmen are through mime.
Yes.
I did as much as I could, and then I would just describe what he was doing for the bits that couldn't be captured on a laptop camera. That was really cool. The first adventure, I think, is the strongest, even though it's mind-bendingly simple. go to village, hear about beastmen, find beastmen, that's it. But the whole thing where you learn about the ancient spirits who are still worshipped in Kislev that have been left behind mostly in the Empire. There's a handout which is pretty cool, like a 2-page intro that I gave to the players to read between sessions. And they have to decide which spirits they want the local wise man to help them call and deal with. Our group, like I suspect most groups, started with the least powerful ones and worked their way up the scary power scale until they get to the Leshy, the big forest spirit, who has a bear assistant. And it's just so atmospheric, and it has all these instructions on how to portray them, and the players noted that they loved the voices. It took me a while to remember what they meant, and it is that each spirit has like these detailed vocal delivery instructions to make them all sound different. So there's the crotchety old man spirit who lives in barns, and the small but unbelievably sinister cornfield spirits who have sharp teeth and like blood as sacrifices. That was just great. We spent basically a whole session just talking to fire spirits of the hearth and related supernatural phenomena. And yeah, just really good, that whole bit.
I'm very glad that came across that way when you played it, that you enjoyed the interaction with those spirits in the first adventure, because that was also my favorite part of the book, is the spirits in that first adventure. Like you said, I like how they're described. I like how they're portrayed. Sort of dovetailing off that a little bit, I think that this book does a really terrific job of GM support, not just in the ways that I talked about earlier about like how to frame the campaign or how to incorporate it into your campaign, but there's just a huge amount of GM support in terms of how to portray characters, like things to say that are like punchy but interesting, little speeches and things like that. The roleplay notes are so detailed on some of the NPCs, and importantly, it's not just like, okay, here's a cool NPC. This is a cool NPC. This is why this NPC is cool. Here's how you can make it cool at the table. And one step further, here's how you can keep reintroducing this cool NPC into the story if your players really like them. Here's some ideas. For several of the NPCs, it kind of takes that extra step. There's one of the NPCs can end up becoming like a bearer or a torchbearer for the group as a way of like keeping that NPC sort of close to the party. And I really like that because I do that in my own gaming. Like if there's an NPC they run into that's like particularly fun, I try to find ways of incorporating them into the party somehow, so that or at least they can be around a little bit, so they can kind of continue to have fun with that NPC and I can put them in danger.
Yes.
I really appreciated that sort of like GM support. I find reading these books to be a bit onerous because it's just not the style of gaming I do, but I can still appreciate that the overall level of detail is incredibly supportive. Like none of it feels extraneous. Like if you want to be the GM who goes in really deep on these cultural details, these civic matters, these portrayals, the information is here.
Yeah, that's right. And especially it's important for this book because it's set in this previously unexplored part of the setting, pretty much. You've been knocking around the Empire, not Germany, for so long, and by default in Warhammer. And all of a sudden, you're transported to a whole other section, and they needed to get this stuff across really quickly. And the differentness of Kislev and the old gods and so on is very pronounced. The fact that they have these sort of... How to explain this? I've forgotten what they've got. The Dolgans and the Gospodars are the two main peoples of right, Kislev. Yeah. But they all live in pretty much the same places now. But still they're separate cultures, which is completely different from the Empire, where you travel to a different physical location and then everyone else there is the same as each other, but they're different because you went somewhere else. In this case, you go everywhere in Kislev, but the people are different and all mixed up together. And that makes it feel different in itself. It gives you this sort of sense of really exploring something that's familiar, but not... it also provides a great contrast to... There is a bit of a problem with the Empire, which is that it's always there, right? It feels like there's scientific progress and stuff happening.
Right.
It doesn't feel that threatened. But if you travel to Kislev, you get to see what might happen to the Empire if you weren't hunting down these secret cults and so on. If chaos is literally on the doorstep, like it is here. If there's a wasteland just outside the village. And that brings me on to the other thing that I think is really important about Something Rotten in Kislev, and why you need something like this at this point in the campaign, is that up until this point, there is a key component of the Warhammer promise that the enemy within has not really delivered, and that is metal AF demons and chaos champions.
Right.
Like you're adventuring in a Bolt Thrower album cover, and there's a couple of renegade chaos gods in here, and maybe like in our game, one of your player characters will for some reason actually drink that boiling blood potion in the temple and become a chaos champion guy. Not really sure why he did that, but it was fun. That hasn't really, like you have the thing where at the end of Bogenhofen, a demon appears through a warp rift or whatever, but that's just like the end of a Call of Cthulhu adventure.
Right.
It's normal, demon. Whereas in this case, you've actually got these video game cutscene enemies appearing and whirling their swords around and their name appearing in a spiky font across the screen. So you know who they are, or have them announce it as they rush into combat. It's that kind of thing that if it was what Warhammer was always about, it would get pretty boring, but every so often you want to fight a guy with a giant, massive sword that was given to him by a chaos god.
Right, yeah. No, that's great. I love that. Let's wrap this up because we're going a little long on this part. Anything else you like about Something Rotten in Kislev?
Yeah, well, I mentioned there are lots of good little scenes. One weird thing I'd like to point out is this. When you escape from the end of the second adventure, the sort of way a suit tries to engineer you into doing it is by being strapped to skeleton horses that are created by the necromancer, and then he creates a Deus Ex Machina to slightly distract the hobgoblins and Dorgans. And then, you have this mini-game of that doesn't use any of the existing rules from Warhammer to ride your skeleton horses and try and escape from goblin wolf riders who are chasing after you and firing arrows at you. And your skeleton horse might start to collapse if you're unlucky.
It's so weird.
It's so weird. It's so weird.
It's good.
But I love it. It's great.
I remember one detail from that where they account for the fact that, like, how can you control the horse if you're also, like, trying to combat the goblin wolf riders? And I think what they say is they, like, stick half a zombie on on the horse with you to guide the horse.
Hold on to you. And yeah. I remember saying this when they were mounting up, and, like, one of them couldn't ride a horse. So, oh, no problem. And it's like,
don't worry.
I think the player commented, this is one of the most disturbing things that's ever happened to me in a role-playing game.
Yeah, it's pretty great.
Yep. Good stuff.
Pretty great. Okay, let's move on to questions we had. I had a few, but actually we've answered some of them in our discussion, so I'll just dial them back here a bit. The characters are part of this order called the Knights Panther. They get sort of pressed into service here. And part of becoming a part of that order is this oath, and there's this, like, little oath that the characters have to take called the Oath of the Knights Panther. Did you make your players say the Oath of the Knights Panther out loud?
Yes, I did, Jason. I'll tell you why. Because it's one of those things that is awkward, after the first line. It's becoming quite boring by the third or fourth line. But by the time you've forced everyone to keep doing it for long enough, it becomes very funny. And so, yes, I did. I made them do it. The best bit was, of course, one player had missed that session. So when he joined the group again, we did his oath taking a flashback. And he was like going, seriously, are you making me do this? And everyone else, all the other guys are going, yeah, we all did it. He was convinced they were lying. But yes, so, no, it was weirdly, I don't know, it just sort of, it worked. But would I do it in person and not online? Maybe I wouldn't. I don't know. Yeah.
I think I totally would. Yeah, totally would. Another question. Is it your opinion that the second adventure is supposed to be ironic? Instead of the zombies overrunning the village, they're like in the village, and instead of the invaders being the zombies, it's you invading on their territory.
Yeah. This is the thing. It's like the structure is fine, but it's just very, like I said, it's very pleased with itself.
I think it's the weakest of the three adventures.
It's definitely the weakest. The players commented, it's like, it's a good idea, but you don't really get to decide anything. It just has these ironic gotcha moments that don't really pay off.
Yeah.
The third adventure is a bit like that as well, I think, but not as bad. And the sad thing is, I don't really know how you fix it. I think you just have to...
Right, yeah. I think if I was going to run it, I would just take it on its terms and just do it. It's anticlimactic or something. I don't know. There's just something very, like, kind of womp about it to me.
Yeah, definitely. That is the biggest complaint historically among Warhammer players about Something Rotten in Kislev, is this sort of anticlimactic, deliberately, nothing exciting happens.
Right.
Ending. Didn't go down well at the time or since.
What questions do you have?
Okay, well, I have one where I think I know the answer, but I'm curious as to what you think. Why are there so many mini-games in this book?
There are so many mini-games. There's like, 4 or 5 or something?
Yeah.
They're like little rules modules, all their own little games. We've talked about the strange, incredibly strange horse escape thing.
There's one for like being grappled by zombies.
The weird bear contest thing.
I'll come into the bear contest. But yeah, and I think the reason for this is because Ken Rolston had been brought in as like a big name to boost sales because he was a RuneQuest guy, you know, quite a famous American designer. And my theory is Ken did not have time to learn the rules to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
So
he was just like, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to make up these mini systems and you can drop them in wherever. And I think that worked. And I think that is also the answer to, well, my next question is another rhetorically one, which is why did no one tell Ken that his magic bear spirit is mechanically underpowered?
Oh, is it?
Because, like, listen, there is a scene in this which is awesome, which is where the massive forest spirit, the Leshy, agrees to help you, but first you have to fight his companion, Father Bear, and not get knocked out within X rounds or whatever. And this sort of madcap scene ensues where the bear has got one paw tied behind its back to make things fair and is trying to chase the PCs and throw them out of bounds in a wrestling match. But what they hadn't accounted for is that if you look at the standard stat line of a human in Warhammer, sure, that bear is scary. But by this stage of the Enemy Within campaign, basically most of the PCs hid in our game, and one of them, the guy who was loaded up on hit points, had the strike to stun skill and street fighting, so he suffered no penalties for unarmed attacks, essentially just tried to punch the bear in the head until he got a knockout. Now, the odds were not great, but they were they were about 50-50 of him winning this fight.
Bad, yeah.
Yeah, so just, man, you gotta... I normally don't care about system things, but this was a scene that was only saved by the fact that it was about punching a bear in the head until it collapsed. In terms of actual gameplay, it was very badly thought out.
I will say, going back to the bigger question of why all these mini games, I will say that I found it very appealing. I found it to be a very appealing part of the book. It had a charm to it because there's almost certainly a way of doing all the different things that the minigames cover in the normal rules of Warhammer.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
There's nothing about any of these things that's like, oh, it has to be its own thing. I like your theory, I think, about Ken Ralston. I think that's great. I actually appreciate this from a sort of gonzo game design perspective. Like, I know whenever I'm running some other fantasy system that can kind of support it, I will make up my own little, like, modules for different things, you know? Like, when I was running Burning Wheel 100 years ago, I would make up, like, new Burning Wheel subsystems as if that game needs more rules to cover certain types of situations. I think the most refined version of this is Apocalypse World and custom moves. So I don't know. I like this as a sort of like, why be constrained to the rules we're given when you can sort of go crazy and do your own stuff. You know?
That's true. Yeah. It's not bad. It's just weird. It's weird.
Yeah, it is. It's strange. I think it's charming in its way, though.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the Chain Lightning round. Go ahead and start, Tom.
Okay. On page 18, there is an illustration of the Tsar of Kislev, and what I like about it is that he looks unbelievably like the late actor Oliver Reed.
I don't know who Oliver Reed is, but I imagine...
you would recognise him if you saw him. No.
It feels like an insult to Oliver Reed, by the way.
I think it is, yes, but never mind.
I like this bit of the woods around Voltsara. Beyond lies the darker, older forest. No sun reaches the damp, littered floor. Corpse-white fungi bloom from rotting fallen trunks, and dense undergrowth makes travel almost impossible away from the few tracks and paths. Some paths lead to other villages, some to abandoned settlements, some to quarries, and some to ancient clearings, ruins and stone monuments of obscure origin. It is here in the deep forests that the ancient malevolent spirits abide, and the servants of chaos lurk.
I am very fond of Handout 3, which is a handwritten note that the leader of the Hobgoblins gives to the PCs to take across the river to the Dolgans. Anyway, never mind. The point is, this is it. And the handwriting, it looks like this is about to sound. Your lot can't get across the river lest we let you. Cost you 1 bison for... And at this point there are 5 vertical lines. And then it continues... That many Dolgans to get across. Plus, you and all your boss boys swears no more raiding Green Boys caravans. That's with lots of Zs on the end. Or you can stop there and starve. Or you can come across and get ripped. And then he's actually put like a nice little to and from address bit on the top left-hand corner, like a child writing a letter to an aunt.
I love it. I like the speech from the leader of the Voltsara, who's a fop.
It's like a Lord Flashheart, isn't he? Yeah.
So good of you to come. Things are a bit of a mess here, you know. Peasants with bits torn off, half-eaten tots floating in ponds, beehives apparently gobbled whole. Quite disconcerting. The lady and I have been quite concerned. Handy as I am with a blade, I doubt I'd be much good against hordes of beastmen and worse. The priests assure me that we're safe here with the manor's shrine to Tal and Rhea, a certain protection against the servants of chaos, they say, but nonetheless we're a bit bothered, don't you know?
Fun fact, that character has a surname suspiciously similar to the bad guy from Death on the Reich. But anyway, my third one is, in the second adventure, the PCs can collect a whole bunch of undead-related magic items. And my favourite of them is one that renders the bearer impervious to fear and other psychological effects caused by the undead, because it renders the undead invisible to the bearer.
Wow.
Yeah, they didn't actually try and use it, which is lucky. So,
finally, I like this bit of GMing advice about playing a particular character in the second adventure. Quote, always pretend you know exactly what's going on. When confused, narrow your eyes a little and nod sagely. Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. I see the title of this is The Middle Eight. No idea what we're talking about. Tom, take it away.
Okay, so the middle eight is a bridge section in music. Specifically, it's a short part, typically 8 bars, hence the name, that comes in, well, just after the halfway point of your conventionally composed pop song. And it is usually distinctly different from the rest of the song. Songwriters always talk about it as being, this is how you develop the song into the next stage or whatever. So to give you an example, the Blondie song Dreaming, actually, if you'll permit me, in a surprising and perhaps alarming first for the podcast, I have a guitar here.
Yes.
God. It's only got 5 strings, which should make this even better. So Blondie song Dreaming, the verse and chorus go from D to G over and over again, pretty much, with some additional bits. And then that's the, so you're at a restaurant, no debutante. And then after the second chorus, it goes verse, chorus, verse, chorus. It has that beat feet, but that sort of. In a sense, it reverses the chord structure. It goes from G, holds it for 2 lines, and goes back to D. So what it's doing is taking the same building blocks, I'll just put that away, of the verse and chorus, the standard song you've been hearing all the way through, and then it kind of flips it round for 8 bars before going back to verse and chorus to finish the song. It is slightly under 3 minutes of pop perfection, as we all know, and this is a formula that really works. Now, it is a formula, so you got to watch not to just use it all the time unthinkingly, otherwise things become formulaic. But nevertheless, this, and you will also hear classic examples in Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay by Otis Redding, that Looks Like Nothing's Gonna Change section, or Hey Ya by Outkast, the Shake It Like a Polaroid Picture breakdown. These are all like classic middle eights that they break the rut that the song might otherwise be in, and they also provide a contrast. So the reason I want to talk about this as the idea of a structuring thing in RPGs is because, Jason, we've often talked about, use of themes and contrasts. So, for example, the idea that, when we talked about Fever Swamp, this idea that you can show something that is inorganic, like a metal dome that had been built in the middle of an otherwise fetid swamp, only highlights how damp and hot the swamp is because it's contrast against this cold metallic structure in the middle of it, that kind of thing.
Right, yeah. You
can do this with RPGs as well. So if you think of your verse and chorus as part A and the middle eight as B, so you get A, B, A is your complete set of things. So let me explain this in terms of like adventure choice. So that's what I'm talking about here, really. The enemy within arguably has, and this is problematic, 2 middle eights in it. So a classic enemy within or Warhammer adventure is you go from place to place, investigating a chaos-based mystery, and then at the end you have a showdown with the big scary monster stroke wizard. So Shadows of Bogenhofen does that. Death on the Reich does it a much longer series of intervals.
Indeed, yeah.
It's the same shape. And then suddenly you have Power Behind the Throne, which is, as we discussed, sort of has the same things in it, but a completely different shape, because it's this talking to people social-based court crawl. but it does have a chaos plot in it. And you also have Something Rotten in Kislev, which again has some of the same stuff in it, but not really. It's not the same things you've been doing before. You're fighting monsters, but there's no investigating, and they're not really chaos based, and like all the themes are a little bit like one step sideways. And then you go back to The Empire in Flames, which is the final adventure, which is like the first two, but really ratcheting up the stakes and so on. So that is like a classic way to set up either a campaign in terms of how you are sort of formatting the adventures you choose, or within an adventure, like if you're doing little set pieces, you would do two that are similar, one that remixes those, and then a final one that's like the first, but turned up to 11. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. I've been thinking on this as you're talking and trying to process this big idea here. And it is an interesting idea. I'm personally probably never going to like engage with this on a campaign level, mostly because I don't really run long campaign games. But, well, that's not true. I'm doing a Trophy Gold campaign right now, and I'm not sure if... Well, for one thing, this concept is not something I'd really thought about when I was preparing what to run, and so I haven't had time to think about how it might apply. But looking at it from an adventure design perspective, I can definitely see that. The most recent adventure I've designed and published, at least, is Hester's Mill for Trophy Gold, and I think I probably did that AABA structure without realizing I was doing that, because as I think on it, it's almost literally that. Like the first two sets are basically lead into one another and involve the secret history of the region. Like that's the focus of the two. And then there's the third set, which is totally different from the other parts of it, which it's like a little like side horror scenario essentially baked into the mystery. It does remix some of the ideas that have been established already, but it's a really different thing. It stands out as being quite different from the rest of it. And then the following sets after that go back to the secret history of Hester's Mill, right, as a sort of unifying thing. And so yeah, I can see that, and it works. Like it works. It feels good. So this makes sense. That little break, the middle 8 break, is very helpful.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of a fractal design almost. You know, you could do it campaign level, choosing scenarios. And in a scenario, you can also choose to, like the example I wrote in the notes is if you have an ice themed dungeon, what you might do is have, level 1, pretty cold, level 2, even colder, level 3, weirdly lush plant life, and then the final level, back to cold again.
Right.
I think it's also maybe a thing you wouldn't use consciously because you probably don't need to. It shouldn't really be a checklist you're doing. But if you're at a point where you're thinking, I'm a bit bored of this all seems a bit samey, just kind of invert what you're doing. Although, I think it's important to note, like you mentioned in Hester's Mill, that third one is distinctly different, but I'm assuming it still has some of the it's linked thematically. It has elements that, right.
Yes, it still has, because the whole incursion, Trophy, of course, being very, very concerned with the idea of theme, the whole thing is like sort of linked by this sort of harvest theme, and that kind of keeps it all together for sure. But even some of the like elements that have been kind of introduced up to this point, visual motifs or thematic elements, monsters, like things that have kind of come up already, do make an appearance in that third set in a different way, or references made to them, but it's through this totally different perspective and this totally different, almost like a separate scenario, right? Because essentially what the third set is it's like a little break. Like they basically get to take a little day and night off and recover a little bit before they go back to the main part. But it ends up being like a horror scenario. And so, it has some of those like identifiable elements for sure, but it's quite different in tone. It's quite different in pacing. It's quite different just in the basic activities that the characters are doing. So it's a break from it for sure. Yeah,
the break thing is interesting as well, because the other example I thought of was sort of classic 70s, 80s-ish kung fu movies. So one of my favorites being Hand of Death, an early John Woo film, where the hero shows up in the village, tangles with the bad guy's bodyguards, loses, gets captured, attempts to fight the bad guy, loses because he hasn't got the right techniques yet, because it's a kung fu film, and then escapes and has a training sequence, classic, and that's your sort of B section, and then goes back and has a climactic fight again in a very extended sequence. Yeah, the idea of it being a break, I think, is useful. If you look at I remember the classic 1996 Feng Shui first edition said, just design 3 set pieces you think are cool and link them somehow. And actually that does work really well, but you do find that you will naturally fall into this thing after the first couple, where the group tends to want to take stock and come up with a bit of a plan before going to the generic industrial location where the final showdown will take place with...
Right, as they always do. Yeah.
Yes. So, yeah. But yeah, I think that the idea of it being a break is definitely there. And I think actually it ties back a bit to that idea of fulfilling a promise that we mentioned with the chaos things in Kislev, is that whatever's in your first scene is probably the core activity you're interested in. And whatever's in the last scene should definitely be that whatever everyone signed up for, that should be in it. But in between, you don't want everyone to get like really bored of it. So this is where you throw in something a little bit different. And yeah, I don't know. It's kind of all I have to say about that, really.
This little summary you have in the notes is very good. You know, AABA, the B section must contrast with, but be thematically connected to the A sections. And I think that's perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Let's go to the next segment. It's companion adventures. I've only got one thing this week, so why don't you take it away?
Okay, so I've got a game recommendation, which is Mythic Russia by Mark Galeotti. That is a standalone game that came out some years ago, based on the Hero Quest system, which was a RuneQuest game thing that I never really played much. But Mythic Russia is great because it's like, what if someone made Pendragon, but it was set in sort of before Russia was really definitely a thing, questing knights period. Pretty cool. The weird thing about Kislev is it's not necessarily meant to be that Russian, I don't think. It's not an analogue to it in the same way that some of the Warhammer things are. But if you wanted actual mythical Russia, this would be the one to go for. It's really well written. Mark is insanely knowledgeable about Russia and its legendary literature, so definitely worth checking out.
Fantastic. I will go ahead and offer my thing, which is a podcast that I almost recommended when we did Chain Coffin, but I didn't because I had not yet listened to it. So but I have listened to it now. I've almost completely finished the back catalog. It's called Old Gods of Appalachia. And the reason why I'm recommending it is because one of the central features of the Old Gods of Appalachia story, this, by the way, is it's just like a fictional podcast. It's just a one actor principally, but occasionally a couple of other voice actors just reading parts of the story, right? It all takes place in a sort of fantasy version of mid-century or early 20th century Appalachia. And it involves lots of old gods and dark magic and pacts and things like that. It's really, really great. I love it. The reason why I'm recommending it here is because the relationship that the villagers in Voltsara have with the spirits in the surrounding forest, the way they approach each other, the pacts they've made with them, the way they sort of respect each other's territory, how you have certain special characters that interact with the spirits, all of that feels very much like the core story of Old Gods of Appalachia. It's almost like, I mean, they're just so similar. And Old Gods of Appalachia is just really, really good, too. It's just really beautifully well-made and fascinating, enthralling story. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, cool. I'll have to check that out. My next recommendation is for a similar reason, I think, which is Hilda, a kids' TV show that you can find on Netflix. And it is an animated show about a girl called Hilda who, at the beginning of the series... Now, this is more Nordic than Russian, but I think the relationship with the supernatural world still works. So it's kind of set in the modern day. And at first she lives by herself with her mum in the countryside, but they've sort of upset the local tiny elves or Huldu folk, by stepping on their houses too much and so on. And eventually they have to move to a city called Trollberg. But Trollberg, as the name suggests, is also kind of built on top of where the spirits and trolls and giants used to live before the humans made a massive city in it. And so Hilda, having lived in the country and being able to see and interact with these legendary beings, recognizes their traces in the city in a way that the people who live there all the time don't. And so, like, the actual stories are quite straightforward things like, she's got to make a model volcano for a science project. But then the problems that beset her and her friends are all to do with the fact that the great raven spirit has gone missing this year, or the little house beings that live in the hidden spaces behind cupboards have stolen your socks and stuff like that. And it's a really charming series, suitable for, I guess, ages 6 or 7 and up. But I think adults will get a lot more out of it, especially ones who read nerdy fantasy books will get a lot more out of it than kids in a lot of ways.
Fantastic. And anything else?
Not really. I dimly remember we recommended some Russianish stuff when we reviewed Slumbering Ursine Dune, so maybe check that out. I can't remember what we said. And finally, I do want to mention a music thing that I came across while doing my research. Now that's what I call a middle eight, which is a 16-hour Spotify playlist of songs that people voted as having good middle eights. Not at all relevant, but, since I found it, I felt like I had to share it.
I love it. I like the title, too. Now that's what I call a middle eight.
Yeah.
Well, listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. If you'd like to support the show on Patreon, we love that. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks as ever to our iridescent editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listeners, for listening.
That's good. Yeah, great. Thanks all. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Hi listeners, Jason from Gauntlet Publishing here. I want to tell you about a couple of new things we have for you this month. The first is Nephews in Peril, a major expansion for Brindlewood Bay, the game of cozy murder mysteries and supernatural horror. Nephews in Peril is a collection of 6 new mysteries for the game, each by a different fabulous author, and some revised rules and gameplay advice. It can be found in the $6 plus Gauntlet Patreon feed until October 15th, and then DriveThru RPG after that. The next thing I want to tell you about is Codex Home, the first issue in Volume 5 of the magazine. Codex Home features new material for Trophy Gold and Brindlewood Bay, plus the all-new game Back Again from the Broken Land, which is about fantasy heroes recounting stories as they return home from a calamitous war against a Dark Lord, all while evading the remnants of that Dark Lord's army. It's a fantastic Powered by the Apocalypse game, and we're delighted to share it with you later in October. Remember, your contributions to the Gauntlet Patreon help support everything we do in the community, including this very podcast. As always, thanks so much for your support.